The morning everything changed, Bernard Okafor was holding two things: a manila folder thick enough to hurt someone, and his daughter's hand. Cleo was 7 years old and wore her hair in two braids that always came slightly undone by noon. She had her mother's eyes, the same dark, patient kind that seemed to be waiting for the world to make sense. She didn't say much on the drive over. She just watched the buildings get taller through the passenger window and held her stuffed rabbit against her chest with her free arm. Bernard Okafor, 44, had built Northgate Timber from a single portable sawmill and a $20,000 loan he'd gotten from his uncle Maurice back in 2004. He'd started with 3 employees and a contract to supply framing lumber to 2 subdivisions outside of Thunder Bay. 20 years later, Northgate operated 4 processing facilities across northern Ontario, employed close to 300 people, and had just signed a preliminary agreement to supply material for a major infrastructure corridor running from Sudbury to the Quebec border. Bernard still wore the same kind of steel-toed boots he'd worn on the mill floor. He'd never stopped. He was the majority shareholder. He was the founder. His name was on the original articles of incorporation and on the deed to the Thunder Bay facility that he had bought outright with cash in 2011. He had not been invited to the meeting happening right now on the 14th floor of the Northgate Regional Office in Toronto. He found out about it the same way he had found out about most things that mattered in the last year. Through someone who wasn't supposed to tell him. A woman named Audrey in accounts receivable had sent him a text at 6:47 that morning. "I think you should be here today." Meeting started at 7. Big one. That was all she'd written. She hadn't answered his calls since. Bernard had been in Sudbury the night before, walking a site with the project manager for the corridor contract. He'd driven 3 hours to Toronto in the dark, Cleo asleep in the back seat with her rabbit, because there was no one to leave her with on. Her babysitter had the flu. His sister was in Timmins. That was the reality of being the only parent. You made it work or you didn't go, and Bernard Okafor had never once chosen not to go. He signed in at the front desk at 9:15. The receptionist, young, with a lanyard that said "Welcome B," looked down at Cleo and then back up at Bernard with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The executive team is in a scheduled session," she said. "The 14th floor is restricted this morning." "I own this building," Bernard said, not unkindly, just as a fact. The receptionist looked at her screen. "I'm sorry, I don't see you on today's access list. I can let them know you're here, and someone will come down when they're available." He sat on a bench near the elevator bank. Cleo sat beside him, her feet not quite reaching the floor. She looked around at the marble tiles, the tall windows, the security desk. "Is this your work, Daddy?" she asked. "It is," he said. "How come we're sitting out here?" He didn't answer right away. He opened the manila folder and looked at the documents inside, the same ones he'd been looking at since the drive down. He closed it again. "We're just waiting," he said. Cleo accepted this the way children accept most things adults say. Not entirely, but enough to move on. She opened a small backpack and pulled out a coloring book. She did not ask again. The meeting on the 14th floor had been scheduled under the title Quarterly Operational Review. That was what it said on the calendar invites sent to Northgate's 7-member executive team. It was not what the meeting was about. The man who had called the meeting was named Terrence. Not the Terrence in the names file, a different one actually. His name was Reed Callister. Reed Callister, 51, had been appointed as Northgate's chief operating officer 18 months ago. He had come from a forestry conglomerate in British Columbia that had been quietly buying up smaller operations across the country for the better part of a decade. At the time of his hire, Bernard had believed Reed's background in logistics and supply chain was exactly what Northgate needed to scale efficiently. He had trusted the board's recommendation. He had shaken Reed's hand and meant it. Reed had spent the first 6 months doing exactly what he was hired to do. And then, quietly, he had started doing something else. The executive team seated around the 14th floor table that morning included Northgate's CFO, a woman named Sigrid Holst, 55, 18 years in the industry, The kind of accountant who could read a balance sheet the way a doctor reads a scan. Beside her sat the VP of Operations, a man named Patrick Grew, who had come up through the mills himself, and who Bernard had promoted from a foreman position in 2016. There was also the head of legal, corporate communications, and two recently appointed VP positions that Reed had created and filled without Bernard's direct sign-off, a VP of Strategic Development named Cormac Farley and a VP of External Relations named Tasha Wren. Not all of them knew what the meeting was really about. Sigrid did not know. She had prepared a standard quarterly report. Patrick Grew had a feeling. He hadn't slept well. Reed stood at the head of the table and presented a document he called a restructuring proposal for long-term viability. It was 43 pages. It had been prepared by an advisory firm out of Calgary that Northgate had never contracted before. The proposal recommended the sale of Northgate Timber's processing operations to a parent company called Dunmore Resource Holdings, a holding company registered in Alberta with significant backing from investors in the Pacific Rim. The sale price was stated as fair market value, assessed by Dunmore's own appointed evaluators. The transition timeline was 90 days. The proposal already included draft transfer agreements. It already had Cormac Farley's signature on two of the appendices. Reed presented this as a preliminary discussion, a starting point, something they could bring to the founder for his review, in time. Patrick Grew asked when, exactly, Bernard had been consulted. Reed said the timing had been a logistical challenge. Bernard had been in the field frequently. They hadn't wanted to bring him a half-formed idea. Patrick looked at the 43 pages in front of him, and said nothing. Sigrid asked who had commissioned the Calgary advisory firm, and what the cost had been. Reed said it had come through Strategic Development's budget. Cormac confirmed this. What Reed did not mention, what the proposal itself did not clearly state, but what Sigrid found in the appendix footnotes during the meeting, and then stared at for a long time without speaking, was that Dunmore Resource Holdings had, 4 months ago, brought Reed Callister on as a paid consultant for what was described as market entry advisory services. The payments were routed through a numbered company. The appendix footnote was on page 39. It was written in the smallest font in the document. Sigrid closed the proposal. She folded her hands on top of it. She did not say anything yet, because she wanted to be certain, and because there was a child downstairs. Bernard had been waiting 40 minutes when the elevator opened, and Patrick Grew stepped out. Patrick was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of person who looked like he'd spent his 20s outdoors, because he had. He saw Bernard and Cleo on the bench, and his expression shifted into something that was part relief and part something else. Guilt, maybe, or grief. "Bernard," he said. "Patrick." Patrick glanced at Cleo. She looked up from her coloring book, assessed him, and went back to it. "There's a meeting," Bernard said. "There is, I wasn't notified." Patrick sat down on the bench beside him. He was quiet for a moment. "You should come up," he said finally. "Right now, I'm serious." Bernard studied him. "What's in the meeting, Patrick?" Patrick looked at the elevator. "I think you need to see it yourself. I think it needs to be you in the room. Not a summary from me." He paused. "Bring the folder." Bernard looked down at Cleo. She was coloring a horse, pressing very hard with a brown crayon. She was the kind of child who committed fully to things. "She'll need to come with me," he said. Patrick nodded once. "Then she comes." The 14th floor went quiet when the elevator opened. Reed was still at the head of the table, mid-sentence, saying something about the transition timeline. He stopped when he saw Bernard in the doorway, Cleo beside him holding her rabbit, the manila folder under his arm. The silence lasted several seconds. "Bernard," Reed said. His voice was professionally calm, the kind of calm that has been practiced. "We weren't expecting you today. We were actually planning to schedule a full briefing for next week." "I got your memo," Bernard said. He hadn't, but he'd gotten Audrey's text, and he'd read the look on Patrick's face, and he'd learned a long time ago on the mill floor that the best thing you could do when you weren't sure what you were walking into was walk in anyway, and let the room show you. He sat down at the far end of the table. Cleo sat beside him. She looked at the people around the table with the same patient, waiting expression her father had. "What are we reviewing?" Bernard said. Reed glanced at Cormac Farley. The glance was brief but visible. "It's a restructuring proposal," Reed said. "Preliminary. We wanted to develop a full model before bringing you in to make sure the numbers—" "Whose numbers?" Bernard said. "Dunmore's." Another silence, a different kind. Cleo looked up at her father's face. She could tell something was wrong. She didn't understand the room, but she understood him. She set her rabbit on the table in front of her very carefully, as if she was placing something valuable somewhere safe. "Daddy," she said, quietly. "Why does nobody look happy?" Nobody answered her. Bernard put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Reed cleared his throat and said that this was perhaps not the ideal environment for. "She's fine," Bernard said. His voice had not changed. That was the thing about Bernard Okafor that people who hadn't worked with him for long tended to misread. He didn't get louder when things got serious. He got quieter. He'd learned that from his father, who had spent 30 years managing a rail maintenance crew and had never once shouted at a subordinate. You didn't need to shout when you were the one who decided whether people came back tomorrow. He opened the manila folder on the table. The documents inside were not, as it turned out, the Dunmore proposal. He hadn't seen that yet. What he had were financial statements he'd been reviewing for the past 3 weeks, flagged discrepancies in the strategic development budget, 2 invoices from a Calgary advisory firm that didn't match any vendor in the Northgate approved registry, and a printout of a corporate registration document showing a numbered Alberta company with a director's name that appeared on no Northgate payroll. He laid them out one at a time, slowly, in the middle of the table. Sigrid Holst watched him do it. When the numbered company document came out, she opened the restructuring to page 39 and set it beside Bernard's printout. The director's name on the numbered company was Reed Callister. What happened in the next hour was not a confrontation in the way that word usually implies. There was no raised voice. Bernard asked questions. Reed answered some of them and deflected others. Cormac Farley stopped talking entirely. Tasha Wren asked twice if she should leave the room. Twice she was told to stay. Patrick Grew had brought his own notes. He spread them on the table beside Bernard's documents. He had been writing things down for 4 months, he said, in a notebook he kept in his truck. Dates, conversations, names of people from the Calgary firm who had come through the Toronto office after hours. He hadn't known exactly what it added up to. He had driven to Thunder Bay twice to almost tell Bernard, and then not told him, because he'd wanted to be sure. Because Bernard had built something real, and Patrick had been part of building it, and he hadn't wanted to be wrong. He said this directly, looking at Bernard. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long. Bernard nodded once. He did not say the apology was unnecessary, because it wasn't entirely. But he understood the territory. Loyalty and certainty were often the same distance apart. What the documents, Bernard's, Sigrid's, and Patrick's combined, showed was this. Reed Callister had been engaged as a paid consultant by Dunmore Resource Holdings 8 months before his restructuring proposal, not 4, as the footnote suggested. The Calgary advisory firm had been paid from Northgate's strategic development budget through a series of split invoices, none of which individually exceeded the threshold requiring board approval, which Cormac Farley had signed off on as a matter of administrative routine. Cormac, it would later be established, had not understood the full picture of what he was authorizing. He had signed what was put in front of him by Reed, and had not asked enough questions. That was its own failure, distinct in kind from what Reed had done. The Dunmore proposal itself was not illegal on its face. What it was structured so that if it had proceeded, Bernard Okafor's majority ownership position would have been effectively dissolved through a share reclassification, buried in the transfer agreement on page 27. A reclassification that would have converted his Class A shares to non-voting preferred shares at the time of sale, leaving him with a payout but no control, no voice, and no company. The assessment of fair market value, conducted by Dunmore's own evaluators, was 19% below the figure an independent assessor had given Northgate's board the prior year. Sigrid Holst had worked through all of this by the time she spoke. When she finally spoke, she said it plainly. This is a fraudulent disposal of a controlling shareholder's interest. The fact that it wasn't completed doesn't change what it was designed to do. Reid said that was a very serious characterization, and that his legal counsel would want to review. Your legal counsel, Bernard said, won't be reviewing anything on Northgate's premises. He looked around the table. He did not stand up. He said what needed to be said from where he was sitting. Reid Callister's employment was terminated, effective immediately. So was Cormac Farley's. Separately and for separately documented reasons. The two newly created VP positions would be placed under a governance review before any decisions about continuation were made. All external contracts, vendor agreements, and advisory arrangements entered into under the strategic development budget in the prior 24 months were frozen pending audit. Sigrid Holst was appointed interim COO with full operational authority until a permanent appointment could be made by the full board, which Bernard would be calling within the week. He said all of this in the same even tone he'd used throughout the meeting. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just precise. Cleo had fallen asleep against his arm partway through, her head on his shoulder, rabbit tucked in her elbow. He'd felt her go still and had let her sleep and kept talking. When the room began to empty, Reid and Cormac escorted out by building security, the others moving to their own offices to begin what would be a very long afternoon of documentation. Patrick Grew stopped beside Bernard's chair. You drove through the night, Patrick said. I drove through the night, Bernard said. Patrick looked at Cleo, asleep. I've got a blanket in my office. Old one. It's clean. That'd be good, Bernard said. Patrick went to get it. The formal investigation took 11 weeks. It was conducted by an independent firm out of Ottawa, with no prior relationship to Northgate or to any of the parties involved. Bernard had insisted on this specifically, and the board had agreed without debate. What the investigation confirmed, in a final report that ran to 212 pages, was broadly what the documents on the 14th floor table had already suggested. Reid Callister had been engaged by Dunmore Resource Holdings as a confidential consultant with a financial interest in the successful completion of the acquisition. He had used his position as COO to direct company funds toward the preparation of a transaction that would personally benefit him at the expense of the company's majority shareholder. The share reclassification in the transfer agreement had been specifically designed to neutralize Bernard's ability to vote against the sale. The matter was referred to the RCMP Commercial Crime Section and to the Ontario Securities Commission. Charges were laid approximately 4 months after the referral. The process, as these things always are, was slow and deliberate and nothing like the clean resolution of a courtroom drama. It involved lawyers and adjournments and a great deal of paper. It was also, in the end, real. Cormac Farley was not charged. He was found to have been negligent but not complicit. He resigned from Northgate before the investigation concluded and did not contest the company's claim for reimbursement of the advisory fees he had signed off on. Tasha Wren had known nothing. She had been hired in good faith and had been given a job description that turned out to be largely decorative. Her position had existed, the investigation concluded, primarily to provide Reid with a second name to CC on correspondence. She stayed on at Northgate in a restructured role with a scope that was actually what it said on paper. Dunmore Resource Holdings withdrew its acquisition interest 2 weeks after the 14th floor meeting, before any formal documents had been executed. Their lawyers sent a very brief letter. No reason was given. None was needed. 3 months after all of it, Bernard drove back up to the Thunder Bay facility on a Thursday morning. Not for a meeting. Just to walk the floor, the way he used to before he started spending more time in boardrooms than in mills. Cleo came with him. She always came with him when she could. On days when school was out, or when he could pull her early and make up the time somewhere. She wore small safety glasses he'd had made for her when she was 5, yellow ones, with her name written along the left arm in permanent marker. She walked beside him through the noise and the smell of fresh-cut lumber, past the conveyor lines and the graders and the stacking machines, her hand in his. Some of the workers knew her. A few called out to her by name. She waved back seriously, the way she waved at people she respected. They stopped at the end of the main line, where the cut lumber came off the belt, and was sorted by dimension. A man named Earl, who had been with Northgate for 16 years, and who ran that end of the line with a calm authority that Bernard had always admired, came over and stood with them for a moment. He didn't say anything about the events of the past months. Earl was not a man who said things he didn't need to say. He just stood beside Bernard and watched the lumber come off the belt, and after a while he said, "Good wood today. Tight grain. That's the Nipigon run." "I know," Bernard said. "I was up there in September." Earl nodded. They stood together a little longer. Cleo tugged Bernard's hand. "Daddy," she said. "Can I push the button?" "Which button?" She pointed the sort control panel, at the large green button that initiated the stack sequence. She had been asking to push it for approximately 2 years. Earl looked at Bernard. Bernard looked at Earl. Earl shrugged one shoulder in a way that meant why not. Bernard lifted Cleo up. She pushed the button with both hands very seriously, as if it required her full weight. The stack sequence engaged, the conveyor shifted, the lumber moved. She looked at the result with the expression of someone who had completed something important. "I did it," she said. "You did," Bernard said. He set her back down. She picked up her rabbit from where she'd left it on a nearby workbench, and tucked it back under her arm. The line kept running. The wood kept coming. Outside, through the high windows of the facility, the Ontario sky was the particular gray-white of a November morning, heavy with the kind of cloud that might become snow by afternoon. Bernard had grown up under that sky. He had driven under it through the night to get to a room where someone had tried to take what he'd built. He had sat in that room with his daughter asleep against his arm, and had said what needed to be said without raising his voice. He watched the lumber come off the belt, and thought about the men and women who had cut it, hauled it, processed it. He thought about Earl's 16 years. He thought about Patrick Grew driving to Thunder Bay twice to almost say something, and the third time finally saying it. He thought about Cleo, asking why nobody was smiling. It was the kind of question that stayed with a person. The kind that found you later, when you were doing something ordinary, and reminded you what the whole thing was actually for. He took her hand again. They walked back through the mill together, her yellow safety glasses slightly crooked, his steel-toed boots loud on the concrete floor. The smell of cut pine around them, like something permanent, like something that had always been and would keep being, as long as the people who cared about it stayed close enough to watch over it.